Good afternoon, and welcome to the first chapter of your seminar, writing the history of the First World War. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that you have to write the history of the First World War, but we're going to be looking at how the history of the First World War has been written and how it could be written. And then in a second part, we'll be looking at commemoration, because it's just past the 100th anniversary of the First World War, and this has given rise to a huge number of events and debates. This class will be marked by a final exam where you will have to show that you understand the main currents within all this. You can see on the screen in front of you the address of my teaching blog, and this is quite important in that I will quite often recommend on the blog videos, news articles, and so on to help you. And you also have there my my email address. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Now that the 102 years since the end of the First World War, and we still see regularly films coming out about it. These are a couple of recent ones. Au revoir là-haut. I don't know if any of you saw that. War Horse that came out a couple of years ago. Slightly older film, Gallipoli, well worth a look. And perhaps the one that's made the most noise this last couple of years, 1917 by Sam Mendes, which had the specificity of being entirely made with one camera shot, and was claimed as a tremendously realistic view of life on the in the in the trenches on the Western Front. So it doesn't look like the First World War is being forgotten. It's still very present in our everyday lives, but that doesn't mean, of course, that there's no controversy about it. And here you see an example from the BBC News magazine. So an interesting idea. The BBC News magazine, obviously quite a respected establishment source, and this is an article by a historian called Dan Snow. Lions and Donkeys, 10 Big Myths About World War I. Debunked, that means proved to be false. Now, the reference to lions and donkeys, I don't know if you know this, but this comes from an expression, I think it's in the 1930s. I think it was a Conservative member of Parliament who wrote the book involved, and it said, well, the British Army are lions led by donkeys. And the idea of this was to say that the ordinary soldiers were energetic, brave, and fierce, but that their leaders, the generals, were donkeys, were stupid, slow, and so on. Now, this can be something quite difficult for us to judge, but certainly one of the debates today about the First World War is what the role of the generals were. How far is it true that they simply sent into battle endless thousands of young men who were mostly working class young men who had no importance to the generals who came from the elite? And how far is it true, as the other group of historians say, that the generals learnt quickly how to use strategy and tactics, and were victorious because of this. If the BBC News magazine and Dan Snow came up with this article, Lions and Donkeys, 10 Big Myths Debunked, they were not unchallenged. And one of the interesting things about the commemoration of the First World War, which I'll be looking at more in a couple of weeks' time, is that it was very much challenged. And so this campaign, No Glory in War, a recent campaign set up around the commemoration of the First War, answers, and here it says, Lions and Donkeys, Dan Snow's 10 myths debunked by our campaign No Glory. And there they begin. The historian Dan Snow says there are 10 myths used to portray the First World War as a uniquely horrific but historically false, sorry. And this is Lindsay German from No Glory in War, who replies and says why he's wrong, and that the generals and the the elite who organized the war do need to be condemned for having done so. So you can see that it's stirring up considerable passions even 100 years later. If you just have a look over on your internet to the Amazon website, you'll see immediately that it's quite easy to find 2,185 books with the expression Première Guerre mondiale in the title or in the description. And every month here you can see that there were 5 new ones this month, and over the last 3 months 27 new ones. This is on the French website, and there are a couple of the most recent ones. Yeah, Les Chicanements sur la Marne et le Jargon des Poilus de A à Z, and we'll be looking at these kinds of books shortly. If I go back a couple of years to September 2018, when I did this survey, I found there were more than 4,000 books in French with this expression in their title or description, and that this included 81 aimed at teenagers, and 437 which were novels or literature, 25 which were letters or memoirs. If we go over to Britain, we found even more. This is, I think, is a similar date a couple of years ago, and we were getting 40 every month. Was it 40 every month? Yes, 40 every month being produced. So an enormous quantity. Here on the UK website, there were more than 20,000 books, including 341 for young adults and 363 children's books. You know, if you have a brother or sister and you don't like their children, you can buy them 363 books about the First World War. That's a joke. Indeed, 50 of the books were aimed at ages 3 to 5. So you can see that there is something. I think you have a particular example, a true story of friendship, where about a dog befriending a soldier during the First World War. They're very, of course, very political books, because it has a meaning to want to write books for 3 to 5-year-olds about the First World War. So, given that these huge numbers of history books are being written, history books and novels and so on, what is our general perspective on how to write history and how to write the history of the First World War? Well, I want to look at a little quotation, and this is about the Victorian age, the 19th century, 1837 to 1901. And this writer said, "The history of the Victorian age will never be written. We know too much about it." And this suggests that one of the difficulties of recent history, that is the last couple of 100 years, is that there are so many documents. Of course, by the First World War, daily newspapers were very, very common. Every big town in Britain had a daily newspaper, and you could very quickly be absolutely drowned in documentation and have to make very severe decisions about what documents you want to use. Whereas if you are studying the 9th century or the 12th century, you're in that very lucky position of having far fewer documents which have survived. In any case, this writer said, "The history of the Victorian age will never be written. We know too much about it." He was writing at the beginning of the 20th century, concerning the age which has just passed. Our fathers and our grandfathers have poured forth and accumulated so vast a quantity of information that the industry of a Ranke, a great German historian, would be submerged by it, and the perspicacity of a Gibbon, a great British historian who wrote the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, would quail before it. It is not by the direct method of a scrupulous narration that the explorer of the past can hope to depict that singular epoch. If he is wise, he will adopt a subtler strategy. He will attack his subject in unexpected places. He will fall upon the flank or the rear. He will shoot a sudden revealing searchlight into obscure recesses hitherto undivined. So this gentleman, and in fact it is Lytton Strachey who wrote in 1918 Eminent Victorians, is reflecting on what can you do when there's so much information, because often we think, you know, what is the job of the historian, and the non-specialist might say, oh well, the job of the historian is to tell the truth about the past. And it sounds like you must tell what really happened. But as this gentleman is pointing out, if you tried to go day by day, you could write 20 volumes on the first day of the First World War. And so you have to do it in some other way. So what should you do? You attack the subject in unexpected places. Yeah? And in fact, this very often involves finding new questions. And I will be talking about that quite considerably. Now, when you look at a historian who has written about the First World War, you ask yourself a number of questions to evaluate them as a historian, to evaluate, you know, well, how useful, how important, how balanced, and so is their work. And of course, the first thing is, which is obvious when I talk about the amount of information that's available, is you asking the historian to be completely objective. Is a nonsense, because completely objective, what does that mean? Does that mean telling everything that happened? Obviously quite impossible. So although we can't expect a historian to be completely objective, and it may not even be a good thing, we can expect them to show where they're coming from, so to give the reader the tools necessary to evaluate their history. And here are some of the questions I ask myself when I come across a historian. What sources are they using? Yeah, what sources are they using? Are they working on letters from aristocrats, or are they working on local newspapers, or are they working on whatever? Yeah, and so it's very important to check what sources they're using, so that you will know. The main question is not usually how objective are the sources, because they're usually not objective, which is fine, but you just have to know where they're coming from. It's more, what are the priorities of the sources? What are the things they're going to say, and what are the things they are not going to say? Every source has advantages and disadvantages. Secondly, what corpus do they use? Because one of the essential things about historical research is that sources must be organized into a corpus. That is to say, you cannot just work on 500 newspaper articles from the time of the Third World War, talking about circuses. And because the legitimate question that is asked of you is, why did you choose these 500 articles? Oh, well, because I found them interesting. That's not allowed. You're not allowed to choose your corpus because you found it interesting, or because it went in the same way that you wanted. Because this is very dangerous. Of course, if I go out into the streets of Paris and spend enough time, I can probably find 10 people who think that the moon is made of cheese. But if I write an article based on the opinions of these 10 people, it's a very little value. The third question, and perhaps the most important one, is what questions. I think a historian is defined by what questions they are asking. And inventing a new question is really a great step forward. And I'll give you a number of examples as we go along of where they found a new question. They found a new question. I even modestly claim to have found a new question or two myself. What methods do they use? Are they analyzing the text with statistical methods? How many times is, how common in films made during the First World War? How common is it to see this? How common is it to see this? That kind of thing. So is it a statistical method? Is it a method based on interviewing people? No longer possible today, of course, but in the 1980s it was still possible to interview people who had lived through the First World War. This is along the same lines. What assumptions, what are the historians assuming to be true? Not questioning, because everybody accepts it. And you will find, if you look at histories of the First World War, they very often assume that it's a very good thing that Britain won the First World War. It may be a very good thing, it may not be, but this is the sort of assumption that they may be working on. And similarly, what objectives? Why are they writing this history? Are they trying to prove something in particular? And one of the tremendous debates at the moment, for the last 10 years or so, about the First World War has been whose interests it served. So there's been a set of historians who are saying, oh yes, well, the First World War was sad but necessary and defended England and allowed Britain to move forward. And other people are saying that the First World War was a terrible disaster, and a terrible price was paid by ordinary people, and that those are the priorities we should be looking at. So I want to take these in order, and first of all, I want to look at sources, and in particular primary sources, so sources produced at the time. We, in research and in historical research, we always consider primary sources to be particularly important. So certainly, if you're at a master's level, if you're going to mention one of Freud's ideas connected to psychoanalysis, you do not quote What Freud Really Said by John Smith. Yeah? If you talk about Freud, you quote Freud. If you talk about Marx, you quote Marx. You go back to the primary sources. But of course, primary sources are not always expositional. A source might be an object. A source might be a casual or ephemeral document. So let's have a look at some of the sources that people have used in writing histories of the First World War. Usually in class, I take a little time to say, what do you think this is? So I'll do that. I'll make little pauses, but it won't be quite the same. This is a map. It's a military map. It shows exactly where the different armies on both sides were on a given day. So its usefulness at the time was to help the military officers decide on strategy. And today, it would be useful to answer questions like, why did the Germans win this battle? And why did the French win this battle? And why did the British win this battle? What were the strong points and the weak points of their strategy? That's the kind of question it would help you ask. So that's the advantage of the source. The disadvantage of the source, of course, is it's very disincarnate. This is not going to tell you anything about the experience of the people who were there. So military reports and maps is one example of a primary source which historians might use. I have about 20 more examples, and then we will see where we've got to after there. Second source then. This is the report, report of the Committee on Alleged German Outrages, prepared for His Britannic Majesty's government. So this is a government report. This is particularly interesting. This is an example, actually, because at the beginning of the First World War, in particular, when the Germans invaded Belgium, there were lots of stories going around about terrible things which happened to civilians. And some of these stories were true. Many of them were invented. There were endless stories about babies being killed in their mother's arms and women being mutilated sexually and so on. And it turned out that some of these were true, a lot of them were made up. But it became a problem for the government because the government wanted its people to believe that they were being told the truth. And so the government actually set up a committee on alleged German outrages to not necessarily with the aim of finding out all the whole truth, but more with the aim of assessing what should be said to the people. And it comes out, it's set up by respected establishment people, and it comes out with the arguments to claim that although some stories have been invented, the essential thrust is correct. And so the British government was rather worried that if people believed that it was all propaganda, that it was all rumours being made up, then they would be less enthusiastic about fighting. And the First World War was the first total war which involved everybody, and the question of civilian fighting spirit was extremely important. As well as government reports, you have parliamentary debates. You will have recognized that this is the Parliament of Canada, but most parliaments publish the contents of their debates almost every day. And so certainly to see what debates are going on in Parliament might help you to understand different decisions which were made. And also you may find out more about what was controversial about different decisions during the war. Very often, like in the British Parliament, you have a certain, if you're a member of Parliament, you have a certain immunity. You're allowed to say things in Parliament and not be troubled by the police if it's where it might be something that if you said elsewhere, it would be illegal. So quite often the parliamentary debates can give you a rich idea of what the debates were among the government, the opposition, and different elements of the establishment. So government reports and parliamentary debates will answer certain questions, and at the same time, of course, like every primary source, they have a disadvantage, and that is that, you know, in Parliament, and especially in 1914, you're really listening to the elite talk to itself. In 1914, less than half the British population could vote. About 3/4 of men could vote, and no women. So you have, you know, like 35–40% of the nation being allowed to vote. So it's not anything like a full democracy for the moment. Keeping on the primary sources, I like this little one. Medical records. Now, this is a very interesting kind of resource because, of course, parliamentary debates are written so that people will understand the general situation. Medical records are written for a very small, everyday objective, and they're not written with the intention of being used by historians. However, they can give us a huge amount of information. For example, the most obvious and easy one is that whereas in 1915, if you were ill and went to the doctor or the hospital, you might get signed off as, oh no, he shouldn't be in the army, he's too ill. In 1917, this was much more difficult. If you were ill, you would nevertheless be sent back into the army. The other question which is brought up frequently when looking at medical records is the question of psychological health. At the time, the First World War happened after Freud had published his major works, I think it's 1899, The Interpretation of Dreams, and in the first decade of the 20th century, a whole series of books about psychoanalysis. But this was not generally the way that mental health was looked at, and it was very often considered that people who suffered from what we would call today post-traumatic syndrome were simply lazy or cowards and so on, and seemed shaking up. During the war, you got the development of the concept of shell shock, and that this is this idea of being psychologically so affected by the battle that you cannot continue. If you look at medical records, you can see how from year to year, sometimes even from month to month, the attitude to mental health changed. Perhaps not in massive ways, but in particular ways. And there was the beginnings of a recognition of the reality of psychological blockage, which was not simply, oh, well, he's really a coward or a traitor. And of course, this whole stories involved tremendously tragic stories where British soldiers were sometimes executed by the British Army because they were unable to continue. One fabulous resource which is still coming out because is letters. Fabulous resource is still coming out because what happens is that people sometimes keep letters, and they are boxes of letters are found in the attic when your grandfather dies, yeah, and they're sometimes kept for a long time. And as the centenary approached, there was more interest in the First World War and in in particular in ordinary people's lives during the First World War. You saw publications of more and more collections of letters. There are huge numbers. Now, obviously the advantage of this as a source is it's very personal. You will see something of the everyday life and the everyday feelings of some of the soldiers. So that would be the advantage of the letter as a primary source. It also does have a series of disadvantages. First of all, most of these letters were men, and if you think that men don't express their feelings much today, you should have seen them 100 years ago. Quite often the men considered that it was their duty not to tell women what was really happening. And this obviously was psychologically extremely difficult. The other disadvantage of sources of letters is who writes letters. Well, it seems fairly clear that people from the middle classes or the upper classes, first of all, wrote more letters, even though at the time of the First World War, almost all the population could write. And secondly, letters from the middle and upper classes are more likely to survive, to be kept, to be valorized, and to come down to some great grandchild. So yes, my family is important, I will publish the letters. And that meant that for a while we had especially letters from the elite. This is much less the case today, because although working class people don't write so many letters and don't keep as many letters, there are far more working class people. And so the end result today is that we have quite a number of collections of letters from all different sorts of people, and absolutely fascinating sources, and many dozens of collections have been produced. Here's one then, A Soldier of the Great War, Letters from the Trenches by Bill Layman. I don't remember the details of who this gentleman was. Here you have another letter, which actually the document, not just the collection. And what's interesting about this letter is it can show you many more things than simply what is said by the soldier involved. You can see that it is written on paper of the YMCA, the Young Man's Christian Association, and you can see that the Young Men's Christian Association, although when you see the word Christian, you might think, it's religious and generally not so enthusiastic about war. You can see this is absolutely not the case, because you see the slogan at the top: for God, for King, and for Empire. Patron, Her Majesty the King, and the patron, the Duke of Connaught. Yeah, so absolute involvement of the YMCA. Now, the reason that it's written on YMCA paper is that one of the jobs of the YMCA was to set up places fairly near the front lines where soldiers could relax, have a cup of tea, and there would always be a pen and paper available for them to write home, or indeed volunteers who would write letters for those soldiers who were not so good at writing. That's an interesting example then, because this letter was written simply for a soldier to send news home, but when we have the document, we can learn things which are not there deliberately. For example, the attitude of the YMCA and so on. Letters, huge numbers of letters. Here we have a quotation from the letter involved, from a letter home of Lieutenant R.W. Thomas. I could not describe the horrors of it on paper. Our colonel was a wonder to see. He had absolutely no fear, and I followed him and helped him all I could in every charge, but he was blown to pieces in the end by a shell. We had, I think, 10 officers killed, 5 wounded, and the remainder prisoners. I was wounded in 2 places, a bullet right through my throat and all the biceps of my left arm blown away by a piece of shell, but no bones broken. My throat, of course, is bad and very troublesome. They put in a tube so as to allow me to breathe, and I can eat and drink all right, but I can't speak at all. The Germans are really very good to us prisoners, and the doctors seem to be very clever, so there is really nothing to complain about. Now, apart from that very British last sentence, this kind of letter, there are many things you can learn from it, not just from what it says, but tremendously important in primary sources, you can learn from what is absent. And what is absent here is shown in the last sentence of the first paragraph. We had, I think, 10 officers killed, 5 wounded, and the remainder prisoners. So the question is, of course, 90% of the people were not officers. What happened to them? And the answer is, he doesn't mention it. And the reason he doesn't mention it is because he doesn't really care very much. There's an absolutely very, very strict hierarchical attitude that ordinary soldiers are, well, expendable, and that officers are valuable. The Times during the war printed at least once a week a list of all the officers killed, but only the officers who were killed. And I think this is very important because it reflects a very, very strict class hierarchy at the time. Of course, you still have class hierarchies in Britain today, we know, but the Times would not dare print only the names of officers killed and not the names of men. And indeed, I was recently in Paris at the Père Lachaise cemetery, and I saw this thing that they put up recently, a few years ago, enormous list of every Frenchman who was killed in the First World War. So there's no question of having only the officers. So that's something tremendously important. Another thing about this social hierarchy, when you went to a private school, that is to say that you were in the 5 or 10% most privileged section of the population, if you joined the army in 1914, you were automatically made an officer. You went to a private school, so no, well, we'll put you as officer here. There was not an exam or a test or anything at all. It was simply automatically assumed that you were born to lead. So this is just an example to go back to the sources of how important it is, whether it's what's said at the top of the letter paper about the IMCA, or whether it's about what this lieutenant does not say. There is an enormous amount of information you can get from a primary source, which is not just the information that the person who made the source wanted to put in there. Now that's about half an hour, and that's the end of chapter 1, and there will be more fairly soon.